I hope everybody's doing well. We're going to begin 1 Corinthians chapter 8 in just a moment. Thanks for tracking with me. Thank you for continuing the study with me as we proceed through the book. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's staying healthy. We come to chapter 8, and we're still dealing with the second half of the book, things that have been questioned. But chapters 8 through 10 also are another unit in that things have been questioned. They form a set of chapters, a set of texts themselves. So in the first 6 chapters, we had things reported. Beginning in chapter 7, things questioned. So now we come to chapters 8 through 10, and evidently Paul is answering a question regarding how they handle their rights or their liberties. When we come to this particular chapter, you have the question of meat's been sacrificed to an idol, or meat that was bought on the market that had been sacrificed to an idol. Remember, Corinth is the citadel, chief seat of idol worship. And you have the situation there where an animal would be brought to sacrifice, but only part of the animal would be used in the sacrifice. That which remained would be given to the priests, city officials, or sold in the marketplace. And so likely, if you bought meat at the marketplace, it was likely meat that came from an animal that was used to sacrifice to an idol. So the question is, what do you do about that? How do they handle that? How do they treat one another with regard to that? When you come to verse 1, you have, again, a dialogue, kind of like we had in chapter 6. In chapter 8, verse 1, he addresses now concerning things offered idols. So I'm going to address the question. They would say, we know that we have all knowledge. Paul would say, knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. If anyone thinks he knows anything, he knows nothing, yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. You can tell now the Corinthians are still being puffed up by their knowledge. Knowledge blows up, love builds up. Here they're being puffed up by their knowledge. Same kind of pride they had with their teachers, the same kind of pride that was their downfall with the man that was immoral, and the same kind of pride that was there with those who were not handling their differences with one another, their offenses with one another properly in chapter 6. And we see that same kind of pride that came across in the marriage questions as well in chapter 7. So for the Corinthians, knowledge was the end of it. Knowledge was the greatest thing. So if they had knowledge about something, for them, that settled the case. But Paul is saying, no, that doesn't settle the case. Knowledge is not all you need to have here. In fact, he will say this in verse 2, if anyone thinks he knows anything, he knows nothing because he wants to know. That's interesting. If anyone knows anything, here you've learned something in the past. You have some information, you have some facts, but you haven't yet learned what you need to know. So just simply having the information, having the facts is not enough. You may have the information, the facts about the meat sacrifice an idol, but that's not the way you settle this question about how you handle your rights. You can't say, well, I know, you ought not to know. In fact, when he says all know, what he's saying is, okay, there should be no difference because all know. However, look in verse 7. There's not in everyone that knowledge. So not everyone knew. There were some that did not. But Paul was saying, they saying we all have knowledge, but not all had that knowledge. So how do you temper this then? And Paul says in verse 3, you temper it by loving God. And when you love God, it of necessity leads to loving one another. It's not simply knowledge that one must have. Knowledge is important. Information is important. But it's not the mere accumulation of information and facts that you need. You need also to temper that with love. And so he will say then in verse 4, these things concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and there's no other God but one. For even if there is so-called idols, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet there is one God, Father, of whom are all things, and we for him, and one Lord Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we live. So Paul begins with the affirmation, we know the idols are nothing. And there's no reality that corresponds to Jupiter and Venus and other gods, Mercury. And Paul will say, just grant for argument's sake that there are other gods. So what? We know different. Verse 6. Yet there is one God, one Father, of whom are all things, and we for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ. So just grant the argument, even if. Notice he will say in verse 4, we know an idol is nothing. But even if, Paul will say, so here's the argument that he's making. You may know some things, but even if that's the case, we know that an idol is nothing, therefore the meat sacrificed to an idol would be nothing. There's no one that compares to God. There's no one that compares to Christ. He will say again in verse 6, of whom are all things, and we for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through him we live. If there are many gods, if there are many lords, they're nothing. So how can meat coming from an idol being nothing, be something that would condemn your soul? How can meat coming from nothing produce condemnation? But then he will say in verse 7, however, there's not in everyone that knowledge. For some with conscience of idol unto now eat as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. So Paul is saying, okay, how's love going to handle this? So here's someone who knows they can eat the meat. They know the idol's nothing, and therefore the meat is nothing. The meat is not going to commend your soul. The meat is not going to condemn your soul. It's not going to recommend you to God. It's not going to break your relationship with God. Why? Because the God is nothing. The God to whom it's offered is nothing. However, if there's someone who may have even learned that, but yet in their conscience have not settled fully in their conscience that the eating of that meat would lead them to sacrifice to an idol and therefore God, Paul says, how are you going to handle that, brother? Or maybe here's someone, as he's going to say a little bit later on, in verse 10, for if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in the temples, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered an idol? So here you have no problem with your knowledge. And you're sitting at the banquet. You're sitting at the party eating the meat. But now here's someone who is weak, who has not yet come to that full conscience yet. And they eat that meat. And it emboldens them to what? To sin. He says you can't be a stumbling block to your brother. Notice what he will say about that in verse 9. But beware lest this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. Verse 8 will say, food doesn't condemn you, but you can't take this liberty. Love for your brother will not allow you to use the knowledge you have of using a right thing to cause your brother to sin. You can't use your liberty that way. You can't use your liberty to trip someone up. That word stumbling block is to cause the trip. You can't use your liberty to cause someone to trip so they see you doing the thing you're fully persuaded is right in your conscience. They may have learned it's right to do, but not yet in their conscience have made that break yet. And they do that, and you doing that have led them to sin. And when Paul talks about this weak brother, he's not talking about someone honoring. He's not talking about, okay, I do this and to make someone unhappy. He's not talking about, okay, we do something and someone doesn't like it. He's not talking about some sort of strict, meticulous adhering to a law through some kind of sanctimonious believer. That's not what he's talking about. Paul is talking about here is a brother who in all good conscience is weak. He doesn't know everything. You may know everything. You may have that information, and you may be fully persuaded that you can do this. But he doesn't know everything. He hasn't yet come to the full conscience and persuasion. The meat is nothing and the idol's nothing. Oh, he may acknowledge there's one God. He may acknowledge there's one Lord. And there's not many gods and there's not many lords. He may acknowledge that. but he hasn't yet come to the full persuasion in his conscience that to eat this meat that's been sacrificed to idol is equivalent to sacrificing to the God. He hasn't come to that conclusion yet. So how will you handle this? Paul says, and because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died? In other words, will you use your knowledge? Will love for your brother allow you to use your knowledge to cause him to perish? But when you thus do those, you sin against your brother. When you take your knowledge you have, but it doesn't restrain you in the use of your liberty, love doesn't restrain you in the use of your liberty to spare your brother's soul, he says you sin against your brother. But more importantly than that, more grave than that, is that we sin against Christ. So it's not just a matter of how we use what we know. It's a matter of, do we love God enough and therefore love our brother enough to be careful how we use our rights? And so Paul will say in verse 13, therefore if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat lest I make my brother stumble. And Paul says the price of the meat is my brother's soul. That's too high a price to pay for a piece of meat. He said, I won't eat T-bone anymore. I'll be a vegetarian. Paul's saying, I know the meat's nothing. I know the idol's nothing. But I'm not going to take opportunity to use my liberty to eat the meat when it's going to cost my brother his soul. Why? Because I love God and I love my brother too much to do that. I'm not going to put my brother in a position of leading him to sin, even though I may have the right to do something. My love for him will not allow me to do that. This is a challenging passage for us today because I have a hard time trying to find anything that really equates to this today. Because to equate to it, we have to first of all prove the thing is right or wrong to do. The meat was nothing. Paul is establishing that. He's not going to condemn them. It's not going to commend them. I remember my dad talking about when he was a boy, they were not allowed to play cards or dice. I guess dominoes were okay because I think my dad was born playing 42. But playing cards or dice was equivalent, that was thought to be gambling. We since have learned that that's not necessarily the case. But that was true back in my dad's youth and the days of his youth with his parents and that generation. But then again, those aren't equivalents. So it's hard to come up with something equivalent to today to say, here's a right I can use that I have that will cause a brother to sin. Meat's not in question today. So I'm not sure what parallels this today, but I tell you what does parallel it. I need to have the same concern for my brother's soul as if meat were the question. And again, it's not here's some contrarian. Here's not some sanctimonious believer. Here's someone I make unhappy. Here's something somebody doesn't like something. It's something I do that leads someone to sin. They see me doing what I can fully persuade I can do. And they may acknowledge it's the right thing to do, but yet in their conscience, they are not emboldened yet. They are not convinced yet. I can't lead my brother to sin. That has not changed. Why? Because I can't use my knowledge to tear down. I can't be so puffed up in my knowledge. I use it to tear a brother down. Love builds up. Well, thanks for joining me in chapter 8. And I look forward to studying with you next time. And stay well, stay healthy. And see you when we get to chapter 9. Thank you.